Hello friends and welcome to StudyIQ. I'm Joycey Joy and today in this lecture we will discuss about the CAG report on GST on the Goods and Services Tax. Now CAG is the Controller and Auditor General of India and we will see what are the report highlights on GST by the CAG. Now before we move on to the current affair, let us first have a brief idea about CAG. CAG is the Controller and Auditor General of India and it is a constitutional body. It's a constitutional post which is mentioned under Article 148 of the Indian Constitution. So it is a constitutional body and the mandate of CAG or the Controller and Auditor General is to audit all the receipts and expenditure of the Government of India, that is the Union Government, as well as different state governments. And this Government of India and state government includes all the bodies and authorities that are financed by the government. So the mandate is to audit the receipts and the expenditure of Government of India, Union Government and the state governments and any bodies or institutions or authorities which are substantially financed by the Government of India. So CAG is a constitutional body. This is very important. Now CAG has given a report on GST. So we will look into the details of it in detail in this lecture. So let us start with the current affair. So if we analyze the current affair, we will see that the CAG's report on GST for 2017-18 was recently tabled in the Parliament. The CAG has tabled its report on GST, that is Goods and Services Tax. The Goods and Services Tax was ruled out in order to subsume all the other indirect taxes, and this report was tabled in the Parliament recently, and in this report the CAG has mentioned about the shortfalls in the GST regime and has pointed out that these shortfalls needs attention by the government, by the policy makers. So we will discuss in detail what are the shortfalls pointed out in the report and why government should focus on it and what can be done in order to overcome these challenges. So we will discuss all these in detail, but before we move on, I would like to tell you that CAG being a constitutional body is very important for UPSC examinations. Now whenever CAG or any other constitutional body or whenever a strategic authority brings in a report, for example NITI Aayog is the policy think tank of Government of India. So such type of organizations, whenever they come up with any reports or any recommendations, these are very important. This is because of the strategic importance of these institutions. It can be constitutional, it can be extra constitutional, but if the institution or the body is relevant, then the reports also become relevant, the recommendations also become relevant. Now CAG has given its report on GST. So if UPSC is asking you a question based on the evaluation of GST or the outcomes of GST, you can mention the CAG report about it. There is also a probability that UPSC can directly ask you regarding the CAG report on GST because this is very important. In your prelims examination also there are chances of such questions. So from that perspective, we will try to cover everything that is important for UPSC and we will also try not to leave any important point under this report which is important and relevant for the UPSC. So let us start. Let us first understand what are the observations made by the CAG, that is the Controller and Auditor General. Now the first observation was regarding the revenue under the GST. You know that GST or Goods and Service Tax is a indirect taxation in India. And under the GST regime, all the indirect taxes have been subsumed. So taxation is one major source of revenue for the government. So definitely GST is connected with the revenue of the government. So the first observation of the CAG is that there is a revenue fall, or the CAG highlighted that the tax collections under the GST has slowed down in the first year of its rollout, and the growth in the indirect taxes of the Union Government slowed down to 5.8% in 2017-18 from that of 21.33% in the year 2016-17. So the first observation of CAG is that there is a significant fall in the revenue for the government with the rolling out of the GST. And post implementation of the GST, that is after the implementation of the GST, the center's revenue from GST registered a decline of 10% in 2017-18 compared to the revenue subsumed taxes in 2016-17. So a 10% decline in revenue for the government has been observed by the CAG. So first point is that there is a revenue loss or a revenue fall for the government after the implementation of GST from the GST regime. This is compared to the earlier taxes or the indirect taxes that were subsumed under the GST. Now, second observation is regarding the invoice matching. Now, what is meant by invoice matching? So, invoice matching is a concept wherein all taxable supplies procured by the buyer. So, the buyer will procure the taxable supplies and it is supplied by the seller. So, all the taxable supplies procured by the buyer and supplied by the seller are matched. This is called invoice matching. Now, regarding invoice matching, the CAG or the Comptroller and Auditor General noted that the system validated input tax credit through invoice matching was not in place. So, how is invoice matching made sure under GST? It is done through ITC or input tax credit. So, this is not in place. That means the input tax credit is not proper under the GST, which is also another yet bigger shortfall under the GST regime. Now, the reasons pointed out by the CAG for this. First is that the complexity of the return mechanism. This is the first reason. The return mechanism is very complex and there are also technical challenges. Understanding of technical know-how is very important. So, these are the two reasons why there is a lack of invoice matching through the ITC or the input tax credit. Now, because of this lack of invoice matching or improper invoice matching, the system, that is the GST system, is prone to ITC frauds or the input tax credit frauds. So, this is the second observation made by the CAG. Now, the third one is regarding electronic tax system or e-tax system. So, CAG has observed that a non-intrusive e-taxation system is very much unclear and it remains hard even after 2 years of GST implementation. So, the CAG in this regard has pulled up the Revenue Department, the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs and the GST network for their failure to try out GST system adequately before rolling out it in the month of July 2017. Now, the fourth observation is regarding the compliance under the GST regime. So, it was expected, that is before the rolling out of GST, it was expected that the compliance would improve. That is, under the GST regime, the tax compliance would improve and this would stabilize once the system gets adopted in the economy. But if we look at the CAG report, the report has observed that all the returns being filed are showing a declining trend. So, the tax compliance is also not performing very well. Now, the next observation is regarding short filing. So, what is meant by short filing? While the return has to be allowed to be filed only on the payment of due tax, e-return should be allowed to be uploaded even in case of short payment. This is called short filing. And the CAG has observed that there are various shortcomings or various concerns with regard to short filing as well. Now, coming to the payment and settlement system under the GST, the CAG has observed that the payment and the settlement system for GST was based on 100% invoice matching and availment of ITC, that is input tax credit. So, we have already discussed about invoice matching and ITC, that is input tax credit. So, the CAG in this regard has noted that neither it is possible now and the invoice matching system is not perfect as well. So, these are the observations made by CAG in the regard of rolling out of GST in the Indian economy. Now, let us see what is the way forward or what are the recommendations that can be drawn from the observation or the report of the CAG. The first one is regarding invoice matching. The CAG has noted that without invoice matching and auto generation of refunds, the GST tax compliance system is not functional. So these are the two pillars on which the GST tax regime can be built. So these two issues needs to be resolved. Now, regarding invoice matching is a critical requirement that would yield the full benefits under the GST tax reform. So, if invoice needs to be matched properly, ITC or input tax credit also needs to be perfect. So, only with invoice matching, the government can raise its revenue through GST. It was predicted much earlier than rolling out of GST that with the rolling out of GST, the tax revenues, especially the indirect tax revenues of the government, will hike. But it did not happen. This is because of the improper invoice matching. So, if mechanisms or policies are adopted for a proper invoice matching, it will protect the tax revenues of both the central government and the state government, and this will also help in better settlement of IGST or integrated GST. So this is because there is a significant revenue loss for the government with improper invoice matching, which we have already discussed. So with proper invoice matching, the revenues of the government can be raised and the revenue losses can be eliminated. Now, second one is regarding tax official assessee interface. So there is also a need to minimize the tax official assessee interface. This means that the assessment under a manual system is not necessary. This is because the returns themselves can be generated through a system that matches the invoices. So online assessment can be done and manual assessment to a larger extent can be eliminated. Now, another important recommendation of the CAG report is that the application of analytical tools and artificial intelligence is very important in order to generate data. So, this will help in avoiding tax evasion to a larger extent. So, analytical tools and artificial intelligence can be used to a larger extent, which will help in avoiding tax evasion. By all these means, the government can raise the revenue of the government through taxation, especially through indirect taxation, that is GST. Now, when we talk about GST, what is more important from your UPSC perspective is the GST Council. So we need to also understand what is a GST Council. So first thing that you must understand about the GST Council is that it is a constitutional body. This is because the Constitution 122nd Amendment Bill, we are talking about the Amendment Bill, has introduced the GST Council, and after the assent of the President, the 101st Constitutional Amendment Act of 2016 added Article 279A into the Constitution. So, as per Article 279A, Part 1 of the amended Constitution, GST Council is constituted by the President within 60 days of the commencement of this article. So, this is a constitutional body. So, therefore, it is very, very important for your examination. So, as per Article 279A of the amended Constitution, the GST Council is a constitutional body which will be a joint forum of central plus state governments. So let us come to the composition of GST Council. GST Council has the Union Finance Minister as its chairperson, and also from the Union the representatives include the Union Minister of State in charge of Revenue as its member, and also the minister in charge of taxation or finance from each states will also be members of the GST Council. So, from the composition, it is very clear that the GST Council upholds the federal character of India's constitution. So, it has representatives from both the central government as well as the state government. Now, if we talk about the functions of the GST Council, it is the highest decision-making body under the GST regime. So, the decisions under the GST regime is collectively taken under the GST Council. That is why it is very important here, and that is why we are discussing about the GST Council today. This is because if the CAG recommendations are to be implemented, it has to be initiated by the GST Council, because GST Council is the biggest or the highest decision making body under the GST regime. So that is why we are discussing it today. Now, the GST Council can make recommendation to the union as well as the state governments regarding any issue that is related to GST. For example, taxes, cesses, surcharges, goods and services that should be exempted from GST, the rates of GST, the threshold for certain categories, model GST laws. All these recommendations can be given by the GST Council to the union government and also the state governments for its implementation. So here two things are very important. One is that it is a constitutional body, and second one, it is the highest decision making body under the GST regime, and that is why the CAG recommendations have to be now taken up by the GST Council. And the GST Council, which is a collective membership of states and the union, should come up with solutions in order to resolve the challenges mentioned in the recommendations or the report of the CAG. You can find the PDF of this lecture on our website www.studyiq.com. You can also follow my Facebook page for more video updates. You can write to me at joyce.studyiq@gmail.com for any of your queries and clarifications. Thank you.